Born March 14th, 1869, Algernon Blackwood spent his childhood in Shooter's Hill, previously an area of Kent that is now a part of London. He and his 4 siblings were brought up in a devoutly Christian household, and as a teenager, he was sent to a school in Germany run by the Moravian Brotherhood. It is likely there, in conflict to the strict teachings of his parents and the brothers, and surrounded by the wilderness of the German countryside, that Blackwood would begin to develop his own spiritual beliefs that he would later label as animist. He would also study non-Christian religions, including Buddhism and Hinduism and Theosophy, interests that continued throughout his life. In 1890, Blackwood would move to Canada, become a farmer and set up a business, but it ended up collapsing, so he then moved to the United States and took up residence in New York City. There, he would make a living as a journalist, despite his distaste for the profession. In 1899, Blackwood would return to England for a brief period before setting out for the continent, traveling through Italy, France, Spain, Austria, and Sweden. In the summers of 1900 and 1901, he canoed along the Danube, an experience that inspired one of his most well-known stories, The Willows.
Yeah, it's so good, too.
Yeah, that's one I still have to read. I've only read The Wendigo, but not The Willows.
Yeah, definitely recommended.
Yeah.
So I think The Willows will come up at least one more time. So I'll wait. But yeah, it's an amazing story. Blackwood is, spoilers, an amazing writer that I really, really, really like a lot. So, yeah.
Yes. Even though I haven't read The Willows, what I have read by him has been great. And spoilers, I really enjoyed this story too. But along with his travels, Blackwood had taken on various jobs. By 1937, he had worked not only as a farmer and journalist, but also as a hotel manager, a bartender, an artist's model, and a violin teacher. Though he published a number of stories beforehand, it was the release of his first collection of stories centered around the occult detective John Silence in 1908 that gained him attention. From then on, Blackwood would write over 200 stories and several novels and children's books, some of which are unfortunately presently out of print. In 1934, he made his first radio broadcast and went on to tell stories on television on the BBC. Blackwood died in 1952 on December 10th at the age of 82. He was, as well as still is, a celebrated author, respected by many contemporaries, especially those who wrote for weird tales, including Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and H.P. Lovecraft, though Blackwood seemed less impressed by the latter's work. He is remembered often for his tales depicting the wilderness, showcasing its beauty and its horror, though the story we're covering tonight, the Pikestaffe case, first published in 1924, is not really one of those. But I did really enjoy this story.
Yeah, I like this one a lot too, and it definitely feels more mathematical in a sense that some of the natural horror he has doesn't, which feels more, I guess, unexplainable, where as this he doesn't really put differential equations in the text like Jules Verne does, but he does get a bit into mathematics here, and I think that's an interesting angle to take.
So I have had quite a bit of experience with Blackwood, although there's no way I've read even half of his output, which is quite extensive. And I was saying this before, but I really like him. I think there's something special about him that, for example, even Hodgson doesn't quite have, even though House on the Borderland is an amazing book and one of my favorites. I think Blackwood has this extra psychological component where he can really, really describe human experiences so well. And strange states of consciousness in a way that almost nobody else could, I think. And it's really extraordinary the way he can do it sometimes. And it's not always in the service of horror either. I mean, you mentioned that he wrote children books, and one of those books is called The Extra Day, and it's just such an extraordinary book that, yeah, I kind of wondered, okay, is it really meant for kids? I guess so, because the main characters are children, and they're three siblings who live in this well-to-do English household, and yet the experiences they have are so great and mind-opening and eye-opening, but like it's this idea that there's just some kind of inner, yeah, like all his studying of religion and spirituality really seems to come through in his work, and I'm not that kind of person. I guess it's kind of, in a way, I mean, it's inevitable that an episode like this get a little bit personal, but I personally don't really believe in an afterlife. I don't really believe, I don't even know if I can really call myself a spiritual person or anything like that, let alone religious. But a part of me is drawn to this sort of thing, and it's maybe especially in fiction. And there's got to be a reason for that. It's like, it's interesting, it's compelling. And Blackwood just has this way of describing the way people can be connected. And that could be something as simple as a really close bond or friendship between two people, or two people that are connected across time and space and eons even. And it's like this glimpse into, I think he would call it like higher space or something like that he's able to give you. And there's a lot of that in this story.
Yeah.
And it's just extraordinary. And his writing style is so good, like it's so inviting as well. It really, really pulls you in. Like, it's so, even when it's horror inspired and bringing about horrific things, there's something about it that's just attractive. It really feels like it's not just all evil or all good. It's mostly middle states, right? And it's mostly, there's some kind of attraction to the darkness or to the strangeness that makes it really compelling. And that it's, again, like in this story, it's not all evil, and it's not all like some kind of taint. There's something else to it as well. And I'll definitely have more to say on that when we get to the end of the story. But all that to say, yes, I really like this story too. I think this is good. I don't know, I've never thought about like what are my favorite Blackwood stories. I mean, The Willows is really famous for a reason. But this one was really good, and it's appropriate that we're doing this. I mean, I kind of thought that we would never really get Blackwood on the podcast because despite, Nate, you pointing out the mathematical basis for this story, this kind of thing is not something that Blackwood gets into too much in most of what I've read.
Yeah, like The Willows, I would not say it'd be a Chrononaut story. If we were a horror podcast, that'd be a different matter, but this is a different vibe, and it's maybe not as explicitly science fiction as House on the Borderland or some of the other stuff we're covering tonight, but it definitely has some very light elements of it there, and there is some engineering and measuring, mathematics involved in things like that. And he also provides a nice insight into the world we live in, and that there's a lot of class commentary in this story, even if it's not the forefront of it. It definitely comes into play at key moments. And he gets in a lot of remarks about how the landlady treats the servants and some of the divides between some of the characters in that fashion, which I think is interesting to put in a story like this.
It is. And again, I think a lot of Blackwood's mastery is in his ability to describe how people feel about things. And it's really funny because somebody said this in a cynical way, I think, in that they maybe were not that much of a fan of him. But it kind of made sense to me because he was complaining that not much happens in Blackwood stories. And he was saying, well, Blackwood stories are just lots of talk about people, how they feel weird things. And like people feeling weird things. Like, yeah, that's what it is. But somehow he makes it work, and he makes it work really well. So, yes.
Also, regarding really inviting you in and really sucking you into his narrative, I was originally loading this up and was going to read one of the other stories we'll be talking about, but I was briefly glancing at like the beginning few paragraphs, and I ended up reading this before getting to the others because it just kind of drew me in, and I think that's a credit to his style.
Yeah, he has a really good style.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad we found a way to sneak him onto Chrononauts. I had never read this one before. So, Nate, I believe you found this.
Yeah, so we had decided to do House of the Borderland, and I was just looking around for stuff that might be possible fits for it on the episode. And this was mentioned in, I think it was the Sci-Fi Encyclopedia, in containing elements of dealing with different dimensions. And I figured for House of the Borderlands, which I hadn't read before doing the podcast, weird dimensions and weird creatures would be the way to go for the episode. So that's what we're getting here. But yeah, the only other Blackwood I'd read before this was The Willows. And I certainly enjoyed this one quite a bit. So from the other 200 stories or so he has, it seems like there's a good amount of cool stuff to choose from. We had initially planned that one Wireless Confusion a while back, but we decided to bump it for maybe a potential future ESP episode. So maybe he has done some other stuff along those lines of weird psychic stuff
and
things.
There are John Silence stories, which are his psychic detective character. And he's not like, he doesn't use electric pentacles like Hodgson does, but he's still a scientist, basically. And he does talk about things like that, like what other dimensional creatures and stuff like that. But he links it a lot in, like it's way more to do with the occult and reincarnation. That was a really big thing for him. Reincarnation is a thing that really comes up a lot in his stories. So you have to be, I guess, ready to accept that's just something that, but on the other hand, he also makes you question it because he has that story that we mentioned before, The Insanity of Jones, which is about a person who thinks that he's the reincarnation of someone that was tortured in the Inquisition. And he feels that the person that tortured him in the Inquisition is really his boss at his workplace. So that's convenient, right? I mean, it's not always so clear-cut. And I guess Hodgson did this as well in his Carnacki stories, where some of them are not supernatural, and some of them are. And there's both kinds of explanations given for two different kind of scenarios where, like, sometimes the explanation is perfectly natural. Sometimes it's something otherworldly. And so,
So the Pikestaffe case begins with a woman by the name of Miss Helena Speak, a retired governess turned landlady looking for an occupant for one of her rooms. While the other suites she owns are being rented out, she is in need of more money and desires a better servant, so she decides to advertise her other available space. One of the people to respond to her advertisement is a Mr. John Laking Thorley. Thorley is a scholar in higher mathematics and tutor to many children from respectable households, including one where she had once acted as governess. Miss Speak accepts him as a tenant for this reason, but also because she takes a liking to him and his gentlemanly attitude. Thorley never tries to lower the price of his room, never complains, keeps his space tidy, and has a precise schedule. After moving into the suite, Miss Speak decides to take a look around his room one morning before the servant goes to clean it, and finds her full-length mirror she placed there with its back to the wall, which shocks her. She believes at first that he had cracked it and is trying to hide it, but finds this not to be the case when it is back in its proper position. However, checking again the next morning, the mirror is once again facing the wall. She makes up her mind to ask Thorley about it, but only does so in a roundabout way a few mornings later during breakfast, asking if there is anything in his room he is unsatisfied with or wants altered. He answers in the negative, though a bit thoughtfully. The same day, she once again goes into his suite to look over his books. She finds books on mathematics that contain merely diagrams and equations with no prose. She is put off by the names of their authors. Most of them are German.
Oh, the horror.
Yes. She's very affronted by that. She mentions a book by Einstein, as well as several other mathematicians who I think are spelled wrong in the book, and I don't know if that's the copy I was reading or if she doesn't know that she's saying the wrong names. I like to think that it's the latter, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I didn't recognize that.
She then turns her attention to glancing at his papers, though not any letters, which she feels would be inappropriate. Taking them out of one of his drawers, she sees writing similar to what she saw in his books, but she also finds a paper that, in the center of the page, depicts the full-length mirror with some curves drawn into it and through it. This unsettles her, so she places the notes back where she found them and starts to leave. As she does, a piece of silk thread catches on her face. She brushes it away, and it slips from her mind. As time passes, Miss Speak continues to feel uneasy about Mr. Thorley, but also feels stimulated by him. Eventually, her servant Sarah comes to her with another mystery. While going in to clean Thorley's sitting room, she realized there were marks in chalk or crayon on his carpet, angled and curved lines, as well as mathematical symbols. They were to be found throughout his suite, but were especially clustered around the mirror. She also presents Miss Speak with several silk threads he had strung about his room. Miss Speak, once again unnerved, tells Sarah she will ask Mr. Thorley about it. However, she is unable to broach the subject whenever she sees him, afraid to ask. It is finally Thorley who brings it up, explaining his use of the marks and threads for measurement, and he promises to use scraps of paper instead of marks on the floor so that he won't cause any damage to the carpet. Thorley then receives a crate of books, which Miss Speak believes he'll have no room for, but he dismisses her concern, claiming he has room. Soon more crates of books and mathematical instruments come, making her even more anxious. She is further disturbed to find, looking into Mr. Thorley's room, no trace of the books and instruments he had ordered, despite the fact that the amount of them should lead to them cluttering the entire room. Soon after this, Sarah quits, so Miss Speak hires a new servant named Lizzie, who asks less questions than Sarah did. She also callously refers to her as stupid a couple of times. Miss Speak realizes she would be happier if Mr. Thorley was no longer her tenant, though a part of her also enjoys his presence. While she fears his room, she simultaneously gains a sense of joy when she enters it, deliberately lingering in it. When she leaves the room, the reality of her life crashes down on her, making it feel intolerable after the feelings of happiness that she receives in Mr. Thorley's suite. She discovers, while in his room one day, a letter lying on his table and reads it. It is addressed to Thorley and signed G.P., and concerns the latter waking up at 4 a.m, then waking again into another state, which he remained in for a minute, and also asks how to call for help while in that state. G.P., Miss Speak knows, is Gerald Pikestaffe, who is a pupil of Mr. Thorley. Still feeling conflicted about whether she wants Thorley gone or wants him to remain in her house, Miss Speak avoids him until an evening when he arrives back at a different time than usual. She sees that he appears worn out, his face gaunt, and his walk strangely curved, though he isn't drunk, but that there is still a happiness about his features. After greeting her, saying that it is a relief to see her, he heads to his room, then descends and leaves later, while she finds herself having an out-of-body experience. Once the sensations leave her, she heads to bed that night, and is woken up about an hour into sleep by Mr. Thorley calling for help. Leaving her bedroom, she walks through the hallway calling out for him, yet gets no answer. She starts to believe it was a dream when she hears him shouting again, joined with another voice that belongs to a young boy. She tries to pinpoint their cries, following it through the house, but cannot find them anywhere. Horror soon dawns on her, and she runs back to her room, collapsing onto her bed. Lizzie wakes her the next morning, alarmed at the disappearance of Mr. Thorley, who isn't in his room. She goes with Lizzie to check it out, and observes the bed, not slept in, and all of the papers and silk threads still intact. She once again hears Thorley and the boy, fainter now, and notices that Lizzie doesn't hear it. They call the police, but Miss Speak removes the papers and threads before they can search the room. Gerald Pikestaffe is also missing, and his case is followed in the papers, as his father is a distinguished figure, and soon their disappearances are connected. Miss Speak still initially hears him and Mr. Thorley, though over time their voices fade. A while after this, a man she was governess to as a child, Colonel Lyle, comes to visit her house, asking specifically to be set up in Thorley's former room. He had been interested in the Pikestaffe case. Reluctantly, she complies to his wishes. She hopes to warn him about the mirror, but doesn't meet him in time, and runs into the room to witness him unconscious on the floor and the mirror move to face the room. In it, she sees not her reflection, but Mr. Thorley and Gerald Pikestaffe among the books and instruments that the former had ordered. Eventually, Thorley notices Mrs. Speak and starts towards her, beckons her. She begins to move towards the mirror, ready to join them, until her lack of reflection frightens her, and she reacts in fear, collapsing and causing the mirror to topple over as well, smashing its frame. Colonel Lyle, regaining consciousness from the commotion, tells Miss Speak that the glass in the frame must have been removed by Thorley. She states that she will lock up the suite and will pray for Mr. Thorley, but Colonel Lyle says he won't need it. And thus concludes the Pikestaffe case.
Yeah, pretty good one, I thought. Some really creepy scenes towards the end there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Was anyone surprised that Thorley removed the glass from the mirror?
I had interpreted to have never been there to begin with, that it was some mysterious material that, like...
I guess, yeah, so it resembled... So I'm wondering, Miss Speck was turning the thing around every time she went in there, right? In the beginning.
Yeah.
She saw it turned backwards, and she's like, oh, that's wrong. It's not supposed to be like that. So she went and turned it around. What did she see when she did that? We never... Not unclear to me, sort of, that aspect of how they... Is it some kind of commentary that she didn't notice until the right... And even that, I thought that was a really interesting thing, where when she did finally see into the other world, he made a point of saying she didn't notice for a really long time that she wasn't seeing her reflection. I thought that was so interesting.
Mm-hmm. What I had assumed was that the mirror was still in place, like the glass was still in place until after he had set up the marks on the carpet, right. Which I think by that point she had not been checking the mirror, but that is interesting to think that maybe it had been removed the entire time. And yeah, it is, there are several points where Miss Speak kind of realizes something a little after the fact, like even when she's running towards them in the hallway, when she's trying to locate them, and then it's like her fear comes upon her very suddenly. Like it takes her a while to really process how horrible the situation is, and that's when she gets afraid, and that happens to her several times, where it's like it kind of comes upon her slowly.
Right. And at first, she feels really positive about everything.
Yeah.
And in fact, so does the Colonel. And at the end of the story, he's kind of like, we're supposed to be feeling, I guess, I mean, this is the thing. Like, this is one of the things that Blackwood does. Like, are we? But we think we're supposed to be feeling, oh, that sucks. They discovered hidden knowledge, and now they're trapped in the mirror world. Yeah. But it's like... He says at the end, the last line of the story is, oh no, it's a good thing. They're happy now. Yeah. Like, they don't care. That was another thing that was super interesting. Like,
yeah. It feels like everyone kind of came out all right. It doesn't feel like there was any horrible thing about where Pikestaffe and Thorley have ended up. They seem pretty content where they are.
Yeah, it's interesting. It doesn't seem to be like some weird inferno hell world, like Hudson or some of the other stuff we were talking about.
But it does mean leaving behind everything that you knew, I guess. And that's a pretty scary thing.
Yeah, though I don't know what's on the other side exactly. It does seem to be like a literal mirror image of our world. So are the people mirrored too? Is there like some other version of Miss Speak in the mirror world? Or is it just these two people who have found themselves in a completely empty world that's totally devoid of people, but mirrors the world of geography?
Yeah.
Perhaps the reason they aren't reflected is because it is empty of all people, and that's why they don't see their reflection when they look in.
Yeah, I don't know if it ever mentions Thorley seeing his reflection in a mirror.
So, I don't think that it's literally a mirror. I don't think that there is literally a mirror image. But I do think that there is some other place there, and I think that it's not necessarily empty. We don't know anything about it, and I guess the thing about this story that really makes you feel almost like queasy with uncertainty is that you don't know. So when she looks into the mirror, or the other dimension, she sees Thorley looking back at her, and he's very inviting, and he's like, hey, you should come with us. It's awesome back here. Like, yeah, you'll never be the same, but it's okay. It's good, right? And we've all read so much horror fiction and seen so many movies that we're like, hey, it's bad. Don't do it, right?
Yeah, I'm good on stepping into the magic mirror, but thank you.
But here's the thing. He does such a good job of making it not that. And yeah, at the end, yeah, it's her, like, all this stuff has been set up to kind of portray her sympathetically, but she's also pretty rigid. She's also a little bit, like, too wrapped up in these social conventions. Like, she feels all these complex feelings towards Story, but she can't come out and ask him anything, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, she sees into this thing, and she's like, maybe it is awesome. Maybe it's, like, better than here. And the thing that makes her realize that it's not is something actually pretty absurd, the way Blackwood describes it. It is that, hey, wait a minute, this isn't a normal mirror. I can't see my reflection. That's strange, right? Like, it's so different than what we've come to expect from this type of fiction, right? And it's so good because it's so much more like, yeah, is there something vampiric about it? Like, is there something like, hey, we want you in the mirror world, we're going to eat you, right? Like, or is it more, yeah, like, we've transitioned to a new type of life by doing this, and it's really nice, and you'd like it too if you just open the door and come with us. And it's not the first and only time that Blackwood does that kind of thing, and he doesn't always make it seem like it's all horrible. Maybe it's a good thing, and, you know, we have all this, like, I think this is an interesting way, too, in which it links this story, and maybe some of Blackwood's thoughts on this kind of matter, more with science fiction, too, is that now we take, like, transhuman states sort of for granted, right? Like, the book Blood Music by Greg Bear, I don't know if you've ever read that, guys, but
I haven't, no.
It's a really good, it's actually in, not The Dark Descent, it's actually a longer work, though. I guess maybe there's a shorter and a longer version. Maybe it's one of those books that has a, like kind of like Flowers for Algernon, where there's a shorter and longer version as well. But in this story, a man who's a scientist gets infected with the new cells that he's been working on because his project is going to get taken away from him, and he doesn't want that to happen. And he's reckless and kind of weird, and so he just decides to inject himself, and all these things happen to him, and it's like, feels like body horror, like, feels really horrific, but at the end he's becoming something greater, and he is convinced of that, and it's written in the story like it's true, even though it's also pretty horrific, and it's the kind of thing that, like, somebody like David Cronenberg was also very good at kind of depicting, right? Where it's like, yeah, like, the fact that the characters in the story don't necessarily feel that it's bad, and Blackwood, I think, is in a way, he's kind of challenging the preconceptions about weird mirror worlds and like, the something that takes you away, the fairies. That was something else that he wrote about as well sometimes. It's sort of like the beings in the willows, right, are these, and they're only speculated upon. Like, we don't really see too much of them, but they seem to be these extra-dimensional beings that have their own purposes and intents. And yeah, in that story, they're pretty malevolent. Like, I don't know, it doesn't seem, it seems like they're opposed to the intrusion of these travelers into their realm.
They definitely did.
But, right. But maybe that's not always the case. And
yeah, he certainly doesn't play up the malevolence super hard here in the way that he did there. In a sense, it almost feels accidental.
How do you mean?
Oh, like them getting stuck in the mirror universe or whatever. Like, not like the mirror was acting upon them, but
right,
they accidentally put themselves there, and well, they couldn't get out initially, so that's bad. And you might be panicking in that situation, but
they seem to be wanting Miss Speck to go in there, or Thorley does.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's not really clear what happens between then and there, but
yeah, I definitely think it's the not knowing makes it better. Like, not knowing what the purpose is.
Right.
Thorley seems to be calling for help, right? Like, he seems to be calling for help, but that call is getting fainter and fainter all the time. And yet, he also seems to be getting closer in a way when she's looking at him. So,
One really interesting detail is in the mirror, he's coming towards her, but he's walking backwards. It looks like he's getting smaller.
Yeah.
And she can hear him. His voice is behind her, like in her ear, which I just thought was really interesting. I like that description quite a bit.
Kind of mirror geometry on how audio passes through the atmosphere.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah. I thought that was really cool as well. Just sort of like really depicting how space had been warped, I guess, by their computations or the way that they expressed them somehow. It's not really gone into because it's not the story from the perspective of the wandering scientists who I think, we do see later stories that are like that. And even sometimes, like, I guess the idea that it was like a young boy and his mentor, like sometimes that kind of made me think of like sci-fi stories where there's the scientist fatherly figure who kind of teaches the boy to do something really, really cool, like fold space, right?
Yeah.
And here, like, it's kind of sinister. It's, again, though, are we just supposed to believe that because of conventions? Like, is it... Blackwood comments on that. He says, like, well, nobody really made a comment about Thory disappearing, but because it was this young boy from a really, really good family, all of a sudden, like, the newspapers were all excited about it, and the police were involved and all this stuff, right? And if Thory got attention at all, it was because, this creepy, weird old man lured this kid somewhere and did something bad to him, right?
Yeah, he's the prime suspect.
Yeah. And it's interesting that we don't get that perspective, and I think that is actually something that a lot of later science fiction writers would have been interested in doing, right? And they would have been like, hey, let's tell this story, but from the boy's perspective. Like, what was that like?
Yeah, the class relationship between the two, I think, is an interesting one, in that we don't really see too much else of their relationship throughout the story. I mean, he's just kind of tutoring this kid, and he's in the background.
Yeah, and he was really good at math, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They write notes to each other.
Certainly this extra-dimensional mathematics stuff was pretty, I wouldn't say popular at the time, but a lot of people were writing about it, including one author that we'll be covering later in the episode.
Yeah. Another story that this kind of reminded me of, and I don't know, I might have mentioned this on the podcast before because it's one of those stories that comes up a lot. It's a story by Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore called Mimsy Were the Borgoves. And yes, that is a Lewis Carroll reference. And essentially, it's about a toy box from the very, very, very distant future, or perhaps some other dimension, popping into our world and coming into the possession of a bunch of kids. And how the toys, which are designed to be educational to this really alien, possibly future, possibly other dimensional society, influence modern-day children. And it has a lot of that, too, like a lot of talk about. It's also suggested in that story that they're happy about it. They think it's great. Like, they're not at all worried or troubled by the fact that this is happening. I think a lot of it is from the perspective of their parents. So it's like, I guess, a lot more distressing when you get it from their perspective, because they know they're not going to see their kids again. They kind of start to realize what's happening eventually because they're like university professors or something like that. And so, but it's just a really interesting story. And I was really reminded of that by this one. I think that one was written in the 40s or maybe early 50s. And they had a couple of other stories that were sort of in a similar vein. Catherine Lucille Moore seems to have been really interested in that concept, like in Vintage Season, with the people from the future that are like sort of time tourists kind of thing.
Yeah, we'll certainly get to her at a later point on the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely a fair amount of her work's planned.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking more about her work as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you had kind of commented on the class commentary earlier, and I do think that is also like the way he does it. I mean, yeah, like you can tell he's, how should I say this, like a sort of a mannerly English gentleman, but at the same time, he's been around. He knows, he's traveled a lot. He's worked a lot of different professions. He knows how people are, and he can really get to the bottom of things. And it's really interesting that he does this sometimes in these stories that are so weird and like have elements of the otherworldly and stuff. And I think that's probably deliberate. I think that he wants to contrast those things. And it's like that, the story The Extra Day, it's this like mundane English family. They have all the money they need. They don't want for anything. And yet the kids the story is about the budding imagination of the kids, basically. And it's like, but he does it in such a way that it's way more interesting than that sounds. Like, it's all about describing how people are influenced by their environments and how, like, places have moods and, like, nature has moods and feelings that you can be attuned to and stuff like that. And yeah, like, nowadays a lot of people would say, oh, that's just woo-woo or something. But, like, just the way that he does it is so cool. And I'm, like, so in the mood to read more Blackwood now after reading and talking about that story. And that was a very good synopsis, by the way, of what happened in it. I knew that I didn't have to do the synopsis by the time I read this, so I was just, like, I didn't bother to write down all the events in the story. I had just read a Blackwood story, like, a few weeks ago, too. A different one called The Lost Valley, and that was really good, too. And so I was already, like, feeling the Blackwood pull a bit. And so this was just the perfect timing.
Yeah, I definitely do want to check out The Willows now. Really want to read that, because it has been one I've been meaning to read, but now I'm sort of in the mood for that.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And his commentary on human nature, I think, is really what elevates these stories in a way, because he does bother to put that stuff in there, and it is a nice touch. But yeah, The Willows is in many places. I read it in the Dark Descent anthology, so it's very much at home there with that kind of stuff.
It's also in the Weird as well, isn't it?
I don't know. I know I have that somewhere, but I haven't actually read through all that, because that's, I think, even bigger than the Dark Descent.
I think it's in both, or maybe the Wendigo is in one and the Willows is in the other. This one, though, is harder to find. It's in the complete, well, almost complete Delphi ebook of the works of Algernon Blackwood, which is available quite cheaply if anyone wants it.
Mm-hmm. And they refer to it as the collected instead of the complete, because they are missing a couple of things.
Yeah, it's not quite complete. The thing about Blackwood is that he supposedly wrote a lot of stories for newspapers, and he did it at, like, very, very short notice sometimes, and he didn't document it, and we don't know. It's actually apparently a bit of a mystery sometimes, but we have over 200 short stories by him and, like, 14 novels and an autobiography, so there's plenty of stuff out there.
Yeah, the archive.org version is Tales of the Uncanny and Supernatural, which I guess is one of his anthologies that he published in his lifetime.
Cool. Yeah, he did have several anthologies, many of which are now probably out of print, but I know there was a recent printing of one that I read about in the Algernon Blackwood Facebook group, which is pretty good. If you want to talk to people who know about him and like his work a lot and stuff like that, and there's some documentation there too, and it's interesting. He seems to have been a very interesting person, and it just kind of makes what he did more compelling. By the way, his readings of his stories, there are some available online, even on YouTube if you want to look, and they're pretty good. Yeah, he's pretty old by the time he did it, so, you know, expect an old English dude voice, but, like, it's he's good at it. And again, like, they tend to be more obscure ones as well.
Yeah, but I can see that kind of voice fitting these quite well.
Yeah.
All right, I think we have yet more worlds to visit.
Yeah.
Paul Scheerbart was born as the 11th child of a successful merchant in Danzig in 1863. Unfortunately, by the age of 16, he would lose his mother, father, and all of his siblings. And besides this, there's not very much known about his early life. In 1887, he moved to Berlin with the intention of pursuing a career as a writer, where he would spend the rest of his life. Scheerbart lived a bohemian lifestyle, constantly on the edge of poverty, barely eating and wearing second-hand clothes gifted to him by friends. According to a piece in the Paul Scheerbart reader Glass, Love, Perpetual Motion by Christopher Turner, Scheerbart's emaciated frame was often swamped in an antique frock coat several sizes too big, with sleeves so long they hid his knuckles. At 37, he married his landlady, Anna, which has been seen as a sort of marriage of convenience, given his struggles in paying his rent. He would, however, dedicate several of his books to her and endearingly referred to her as the Bear. Despite his lack of financial success, Scheerbart strongly established himself in the literary scene of the city, being known to frequent multiple Berlin cafes. He also was quite prolific in his writing. He founded Verlag Deutscher Fantastien, I apologize for butchering that, or publishing house of German fantasists in 1892, under which he would publish some of his first books. Scheerbart wrote hundreds of minor works and 30 major ones, many of which, unfortunately, are still not available in English. His most notable work for English speakers is his book Glass Architecture, where Scheerbart imagined a world embracing the use of glass structures, specifically of colored glass. His fascination with crystal cities and glass buildings continues in other works by him. However, in a move that aligns with his sense of humor and refusal to take anything too seriously, Scheerbart would also mock his ideas in some of these stories, depicting people taking these concepts to extremes. Scheerbart was also an inspiration for multiple contemporary or near-future artists and art movements. Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus School, recommended Scheerbart's glass architecture to fellow architects. Hans Richter, a Dadaist painter and experimental filmmaker, cited Scheerbart as an influence on Dada as a whole. Bruno Taut, an architect who worked closely with Scheerbart and considered him a mentor, executed the latter's ideas in his own work. Scheerbart would die in 1915. Some believe that his death was caused by intentional starvation, a protest against World War I, as Scheerbart was firmly anti-war and had written a warning about the potential devastation air warfare would cause a few years before war broke out. However, others claim that it was likely caused by alcoholism, as he was known to be a heavy drinker. Either way, Scheerbart's influence diminished after his death, and his name has become quite obscure. Luckily, there has been an effort in the past few decades to bring much-deserved attention back to his work, and multiple pieces have been translated into English. One such story is one we'll be covering tonight, Malvu the Helmsman, first published in 1912.
Yeah, the reader, the Glass Houses reader, has some really cool pictures of his architectural designs, and I really like the way that Dadaist, futurist type of architecture from this time period looks. It's very science fiction looking in a way.
That's really cool.
There's also some pictures that are pretty interesting of a gallery exhibition he did. It's drawings of what is potentially past, I can't remember exactly where it was, I think like past Jupiter or something. And it has like basically these celestial beings that are made of, they're human-like, but also made of like constellations and stuff like that. It's really interesting.
Amorphous beings.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And certainly speculation of what's far, far out there is the heart of the story tonight.
Yes.
This is an example of a story that I guess we'll be seeing a lot more of in science fiction, which I don't know if we've seen too much yet, but I think we've definitely seen one case, although it was sort of still from a human perspective. But I guess what I'm talking about is the wholly alien perspective from a being that's not at all human or humanoid. And that's definitely something that we see a lot more of in later science fiction. But until this time, I don't know. I mean, I guess there's Micromegas.
Yeah. We also saw Star Side, but I mean, again, that was episode 3. And we haven't encountered anything really since then. I mean, I guess as you alluded to Voyage to Arcturus, getting a human perspective on this weird world. But yeah, I can't really think of anything since those really early things that we covered.
Yes, it seems like that's a common thing that Scheerbart really liked to do during his work, especially he has a work in the Big Book of Science Fiction that I also read. The story is called The New Overworld, and it's very similar in that it introduces you to a completely alien society, and it seems like Scheerbart liked to have stories that have a problem that is very easily solved by the end of the story. He liked making places into utopias very quickly.
But to them, it seemed like such an ordeal. This whole situation was quite an ordeal.
Yeah.
I definitely thought this was, I guess it was very good at, like, showing that very different perspective, but doing it in a way that was very relatable. But it was so short.
Yes, for a short story, it definitely packs in quite a bit. There's a lot to process in it.
Again, it's like, I guess there's this difference, like, these beings are, well, we'll get to it, but they're, like, spiritually cut off, right? Like, they're cut off by this layer of cloud. And
yeah, it's a very interesting world for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And does he go into the exobiology stuff in that other story, or does he just do it in this one?
He does some, because there's two different races. I believe it's on Venus that it takes place. And there's creatures that are different because one creature develops off of the other. And they are more mobile than the others. They aren't stationary. Right. So they have to find a way to live together. It's very interesting how he has those kinds of stories where he kind of introduces a problem that they then are able to solve, and you come up with a solution.
Yeah, and I guess the exobiology speculation is an interesting angle, as it kind of shows the creativity in thinking about how life forms would take place on a totally different environment. So if you were to change the environment, and I guess in this story's case, in several radically different ways than the one on Earth, what would the creatures there look like? How would they adapt to their habitat? And what would their conception of the universe be?
I think it's also cool that all these creatures are different. He says that every one of them looks different. They don't have the same number of limbs. Some of them may not even have limbs at all. Some of them are like different shapes. I don't know. For some reason, I thought that was cool.
And even they change. The creatures themselves may look completely different from like one time seeing them and the next time you see them. Sometimes they say that certain friends of theirs can't recognize them after they haven't seen them for a few years because of how rapidly they change. Everything seems in this story is about change and how the creatures and the world that they inhabit transforms.
Yeah, I think the book that this story appeared in, it was the same anthology of German and Austrian science fiction we used last time.
Is it the Black Glass?
Yeah, that's it. They mentioned something along the lines of this kind of being a spiritual allegory, in the sense that the voyage is an internal change, both mentally and physically.
I definitely did get the sense of the spiritual allegory, but I'm not, like, I feel like I'm not sure I totally understood the allegory. I mean, I got a vague sense of what it was. Like, these beings, even though physically they don't resemble each other at all sometimes, and they're changing all the time, they are somehow, they're blotted out from the light of, I guess, illumination, well, obviously, or enlightenment then, by the cloud cover that also nourishes them. I know you're going to describe this shortly, so I should probably save this for afterwards, but it just seems, like, I obviously feel that that's talking about humanity, right?
Yeah, I mean, when we describe alien creatures like that, it's almost never like a totally alien thing. It's almost always a reflection of humanity in some way. Or at least we certainly haven't encountered anything truly alien from this time period. Certainly going forward, you could probably find some examples of that.
So what happens in this crazy thing?
Yes, let's get into that. So, Malvu is set on an asteroid known as Vesta, a world, like in many of Scheerbart's stories, is quite different from our own. The inhabitants of Vesta are described as having no need to eat, gaining nutrients through funnels on top of their heads, which gather food that drops from the impenetrable clouds that surround their world. Vestans have no body, just heads, from which sprout their funnels and other limbs, the number and appearance of which vary from each Vestan, and at time painlessly break off from them. They also live on islands that float on the ocean that covers the entirety of Vesta, islands which can get caught in whirlpools and crash into each other, which forces the Vestans to rebuild everything. Because of this danger, Vestans appoint a helmsman to navigate and steer their islands, as well as several deputies. As one can assume from the title, Malvu is one such helmsman, who one day has all of his limbs fall off at once, leaving his deputies in charge of his duties. Malvu loses his limbs while working on manuscripts, which he then yells for other Vestans, including his deputies, to fetch for him before they are blown off the island. But they are busy at first trying to saw off a part of the island, as it, like those who live on it, changes by expanding and diminishing its land. While waiting for the others to get his manuscripts, Malvu is left to think about the trouble that is put into steering and maintaining the islands. He resolves to find a way to anchor their island and connect the others to theirs, so there will be no more threats of crashing into each other. Malvu's brothers, Zika and Pika, help Malvu get to a place where he can be alone and think of a solution to their problem. Besides the islands, there are also pillars that rise from the ocean called lighthouses, which Vestans don't stay on because they have less access to the food that drops from the sky there. This is where Malvu decides to stay, so his brothers tie him by rope to an arrow which they shoot into the lighthouse. While out on this arrow, Malvu has an idea of building terraces against the lighthouse that would allow for Vestans to remain on the structures and still have access to food. He shares this idea with the others once his limbs grow back and he returns from the lighthouse. It is soon adopted, and the islands are abandoned. Now that they no longer have to attend to their islands, the Vestans have time to contemplate what lies beyond the clouds that surround their asteroid.
Yeah, what a really cool story. I like this one a lot.
Yeah, I thought this one was really cool. I liked that there was so much packed into it.
Yeah. It's like the one from last time from the German anthology, The Martian Spy. Again, really short, but he puts a lot in there. I kind of wonder if that was like the style that a lot of the German authors were writing in at the time of these like really dense works, but like dense in ideas, not dense in like obtuse prose or getting bogged down with like philosophical tedium or anything like that. But he packs a lot in here for the amount of pages it is. I mean, this is one of the shortest works we've covered on the podcast, not just this episode, but like in general.
I don't know. It says at the end that they're able to contemplate the world beyond, and they think they have such a greater understanding. I guess my question is, do they really? Is Scheerbart saying they do? I'm not sure. I did like this too, but it left me scratching my head just a little bit, because I don't quite know what he was... I don't know. I feel not quite equipped to say what he was getting at with this.
Yeah, I get a sense it was kind of a allegory for lifting yourself up on the metaphorical rock above the chaos and craziness of the world below, so you could just stick your head in the clouds and feel free to contemplate spirituality.
Yeah. Sort of finding a source of like stability among of all this change.
Exactly. Little cave hollowed out and an anchor.
On their arrows.
Yeah, right. Now, there's a lot of comic stuff in this story too. The losing limbs just spontaneously.
Yeah.
I think Pika and Zika have their limbs accidentally regrow into one another, and this makes everybody quite amused. A lot of stuff like that in here.
So the other instance we did see something like that was in Indeed a Voyage to Arcturus with the beings on that planet, including the traveler who goes there, attaining those kind of abilities and qualities of life. So here, it's just like a very matter-of-fact part of who these people are. So...
Yeah, and it makes sense that there is that comical nature that seems to be quite a staple of Scheerbart's work. And in fact, one thing that was in the Reader, one of the essays, is that he usually would, during his readings, just burst into laughter over his own prose and would go into hysterics and just cause everyone to be infected by like laughter. So maybe that happened during this story.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I get the sense he would have gotten along pretty well with Jarry and Franz if the two would speak each other's languages and could put aside their differences, which I guess by the time World War I broke out didn't look very likely.
Yeah, another writer who perhaps, was ended far too soon by the First World War, one way or the other.
Yeah.
Even if it wasn't in the field.
Yeah.
But we don't know if that's true or not, right? There seems to be speculation about that.
Yeah, there's a bit of a divisive nature to that.
Yeah. And, I can kind of imagine, from the little that I know of him, I can kind of imagine him, looking on the news of what's happening in the war and thinking it, so absurd and being like, hey, there's a really easy solution to your problems. You know that, right?
Yeah, I think there is a story they said where they do, it is him solving war on another planet. They have, another story where it's set on a planet where there is war, and the ending is them solving for peace.
Yeah, it's always a good thing to achieve.
Yeah.
So that is something that he talks about. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I'd certainly like to read more of his stuff. It'd be interesting to see what's been translated into English so far. I guess that one in the Big Book of SF is one.
Yeah, the New Overworld.
Yes.
And that is a sort of similar length, similar almost in a way concept. So, yeah, I don't know. He definitely seems to be writing from a certain theme or perspective here. That seems like all about this awakening, and maybe it's a small awakening, but from another perspective, it's something huge and life-changing, right? And it's something, I don't know, but I guess that's the question that I have, because in the end, it does seem like there's some doubt. It seems like, it's like some of the academics in some of the stories that we read are like the clouds or something like that, right? Is there something slightly satirical about the fact that now we're just living on these lighthouse things, and it's still kind of precarious?
Yeah, I mean, you still have your head in the clouds.
Yeah.
And perhaps it's not necessarily finding stability will guarantee that, you have a better understanding of life, but that it just makes it seem so because you're not worried all the time about everything going on around you.
And that's a big thing about the clouds to begin with. I mean, they're how their whole reality is shaped and how their understanding of the universe is shaped. And, if you think about if we had them here, we wouldn't be able to see the moon, we wouldn't be able to see the sun, we wouldn't be able to see any of the planets around us. Possibly not even know the Earth rotates around anything, that it spins on its axis or anything like that. Our knowledge of what's around us would be severely limited.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
It's things like that just kind of shape our understanding of the universe, of what we can ascertain from our observations and what we can't. And sometimes when you remove or change something like that, the underlying foundation of the understanding of the world changes with that change.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that definitely reminds me of a lot of things that writers of science fiction will be thinking about for decades to come, and well into the future, I'm sure. That's a really interesting concept too, to think about how other forms of life may perceive things so differently because of their environment, that the conclusions they come to about things are very different from ours, and the developments can be quite strange from our perspective. But and here's why, again, I wouldn't have minded more of this. I wouldn't have minded more of this world. What happens, what do they think about after they're here on the lighthouses? I don't know. It was such a tantalizing glimpse, I guess, but it is only a glimpse.
No, it is. Yeah, it's very short.
As a fan of short stories, I wish this was a longer short story. But yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah, so we're definitely going to try to slot more Scheerbart into the podcast when we can.
Yes.
We'll have to poke around to see what's out there. Maybe we could try to drag some of this into the English language on our own. We'll see. We tried it with Italian. I think that worked out okay enough.
Yes, and I do know that there are a couple of publications of his work that are not available online, but they are available through Wakefield Press, which is a publishing company that's put out quite a few different obscure authors and has a couple that we've covered on the podcast, including John Ray. John Ray has several different short story collections published by them.
Okay, is that the Seven Tales one?
No, there's several others. They have Whiskey Tales, and there's a couple of other ones that are different collections that they have published. I think they are the
Right.
original collections by John Ray.
Yeah, they seem to do really good work.
I definitely want to probably purchase some of those in the future. Perhaps I will get a hand on one of the Scheerbart titles.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this one is pretty promising for his other works, and some of the other stuff just sounds so strange and interesting. Like he did a ballet apparently with Strauss, which sounds so off the wall wild, like
Oh, yeah.
with dancing and celestial music and all that kind of stuff. I can't find any concrete information about it, either the text or the music score, but
So there was some music written for this.
Yeah,
You said
there
it
was.
was by
It was-
Richard Strauss, of all people.
Yeah,
He's
and it
a
was
really
performed
popular
and all that.
composer.
Yeah.
So you'd think that if there was stuff out there, it would be pretty easy to find because of his name. But I guess, yeah, see, showing some lack of knowledge here in classical music, because apparently there are very obscure works by a very popular composer, Richard Strauss. But
Yeah, I couldn't find the sheet music for it anywhere, so I don't know what survives and what doesn't. But yeah, an interesting angle to pursue if it can be pursued further.
cool. Yeah, so I almost a feeling like a revisit to Starside territory there.
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
Scheerbart.
Yeah, and without any of the racism stuff that brought Starside down. So
Oh, yeah.
that's always a plus.
But without the incredible playings either.
Yeah, right. No drama in this one.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I don't really have anything else to add about this because it is so short and it is sort of mystifying, but I think that talking to you guys about it has sort of crystallized it a little bit for me. I mean, I did enjoy the strangeness of it, and I felt that it was an allegory, but I was left feeling a little mystified. But the story is so short that I didn't really feel that, like, I had no feeling like, oh, I wasted my time reading this. Like, it was still really cool.
Yeah.
I just was a little like, and even I guess I didn't quite realize how short it was when I started it, and so I was actually taken aback when I got to the last line of the story. And I was like, oh, okay, they're on the lighthouses. Yeah, that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to give us a glimpse, and he wanted to show us how a strange mentality that is exposed to the universe in a completely different way than we are might go about something like a transition like this.
Yep, I certainly enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Read it. What do we have next? I think it's an unfinished communication.
Yes. So I guess we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in a minute with, some more weird stuff. That's for sure.